This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. The European economy this week got some much-needed support. First from the ECB when it expanded and extended its bond buying program, and then from European leaders who agreed to an historic $2.2 trillion budget and stimulus package, complete with jointly issued debt. To take us through what this may mean for the European economy and for the future of the alliance, we welcome now Niall Ferguson. He's Hoover Institution's senior fellow and the author of so many books, but one of them, one of my favorite, is The Ascent of Money. Welcome back, Niall. Great to have you with us. So it looked like Europe sort of rose up as one this week and said, we're really going to do some things together and make a difference on the economy. Is that reading too much into it?
Well, no, I don't think it is, David. Compared with Europe's performance after the global financial crisis struck, things are going a lot better, because if you think back to the period after 2009, actually things went terribly badly wrong. The European Central Bank initially felt quite wrongly that it should tighten policy, and then there was a kind of cascade of debt crises, which led to all kinds of economic pain, particularly in the south of Europe, most severely in the case of Greece. This time around, it's a different story. After an initial tiny wobble over the arcane question of Italian spreads, Christine Lagarde has been an assured president of the European Central Bank, and most importantly, this next generation EU fiscal package has, in marked contrast to what happened back after the financial crisis, raised a substantial amount of money to distribute to those member states that are struggling with COVID-19, and it's been financed partly out of so-called Euro bonds. So yeah, this is definitely progress if you are one of those people who thinks that the European Union should be more like a federation and should do things like issuing its own debt and doing large-scale fiscal transfers between member states. Of course, if you're a Eurosceptic, this just proves that Europe is turning into a superstate. I would add one other thing, David. Those people who think this is the Hamilton moment after Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, are exaggerating. This is not a complete transformation of European finances. The old problem of Italian debt, of the debt of the individual member states, hasn't been solved and will come back at some point to haunt us.
So I want to come back to the larger question about where Europe is heading, but how did we get here? I mean, the narrative is, maybe even the meme, if I'm using that term right, is that Angela Merkel once again rode in and got this thing done, maybe as her swan song as the leader of Europe. Is that a fair interpretation of what happened?
I don't think that's quite right. I mean, Western media, particularly English language media, tend to exaggerate the power of Angela Merkel. Certainly she has been the dominant figure of German politics for so long that one can hardly remember who was chancellor before her. But in reality, these things only happen if there is a real consensus that extends not only to the obvious other big countries like France and Italy, but to some of those smaller countries that still punch above their weight, like the Netherlands. It's pretty hard to do anything of this sort if you can't get the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte on board. So I think it's really more that Merkel, in partnership with the French President Emmanuel Macron, was able to put together a coalition of the willing to get the votes and ultimately even to overcome the opposition of those recalcitrant populists in Poland and Hungary who didn't like the sound of the strings that were being attached to this package with respect to rule of law in their countries. Macron is in many ways as important as Merkel these days, and I'll give you one example of that. Early in the pandemic, when things were getting really bad in Europe, Macron said, if we can't do something about this, if we can't pull together and engage in some kind of joint fiscal effort, then really the populists will win and implicitly Europe will fall apart. That was much stronger language than anything that Angela Merkel said. And I do think that Macron is increasingly the driving force that will become even more dominant in European politics when Merkel finally leaves the political stage next year, as she has pledged to do.
Niall, you mentioned that pesky little issue with Poland and Hungary where there was some sort of non-binding side letter that got it done. I wonder if that was a victory of diplomacy or maybe a hostage of fortune, because there seems to be a fundamental disagreement on things like rule of law, and it seems like they've sort of put that off to the side. Is that possibly some division out there extant with respect to Europe, and particularly with the United Kingdom about to leave?
Well, I don't think one should overdo this. In truth, there was a certain amount of domestic politics involved, particularly with respect to Poland and its coalition government. But in reality, the amounts of money coming to Hungary and Poland under this deal was so large that it seemed highly unlikely that they would have the leverage to veto, and indeed they did not. But you've raised the much bigger question of Brexit, because the UK is leaving. There's going to be a lot of brinkmanship between now and the end of the year to decide the exact terms of the divorce, which still have not been finalized. And I think that's a much more significant change, because with Britain's departure, the basic political geometry of the European Union changes. For years, Britain, after it joined in the 1970s, said, we're in this for an economic common market, but we don't want a federal United States of Europe. And ultimately, the more it looked as if that was the direction of travel for Europe, the more likely it became that Britain would leave. Well, with Britain gone, there's no real obstacle to further integration, particularly of the fiscal side. Remember, Europe has a monetary union. It doesn't include all the member states, but it includes most of them. And it is moving in the direction of having some more integrated fiscal policy. And the Brits aren't there really to drag their feet and slow that process down anymore. But as I mentioned, there are going to be nail-biting days between now and the end of the year as we see a wonderful combination, the combination of Boris Johnson's love of brinkmanship, which goes back all the way to his days at Oxford when I first knew him, and the European Union's love of kicking the can down the road for as long as possible and as late into the night as possible. So I think ultimately they will reach a deal on these arcane questions of fisheries and level playing fields that all European journalists have to talk about, but it'll be at the very last minute, and as I said, there'll be a lot of nail-biting between now and then.
Yeah, exactly, and as you suggest, people like Boris Johnson might enjoy some of that attention that comes with the nail-biting. You know him better than I do, but it does strike me that he sort of likes being in the spotlight, perhaps a little bit like President Trump has enjoyed it. Many thanks. We really appreciate Neil Ferguson. Whenever he's with us, he is of the Hoover Institution. Coming up, former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor on how prospects of a recovery are affecting his business at Moelis & Company.
The reduced cost of capital that's fueling the fact that money's got to go somewhere, and there's plenty of potential, I think, that people see beyond just this pandemic.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
those who thought that if anything so horrible as the election of a Democrat should occur, the bond market would panic and gold would soar, turned out to be suffering from just another superstition.
That was Louis Rukeyser on Wall Street Week back in 1992, just